A new headline from the New York Times. Trump hires scientists who doubt the consensus on climate change. Over the last 4 years, President Biden primarily focused the Department of Energy on green energy, which made energy for most Americans more expensive and less reliable. In an effort to make energy more affordable and more abundant, President Trump has recentered the Department of Energy on actual energy. But the New York Times is taking issue with some of these recent appointments. Those include Professor Stephen E. Koonin, a physicist and author of a best-selling book that calls climate science unsettled. Professor John Christy, an atmospheric scientist who doubts the extent to which human activities cause global warming. So as you hear those descriptions, these are all very, very impressive and extensive credentials. But the New York Times does not like the fact that they don't agree with what they call the consensus on climate change. Now, if you look up what that consensus is, first, climate change is happening. Now, most people generally agree the climate is changing. Sure, some have questions about what parts of it are changing, what parts of it are a longer pattern in history with weather and things like that. But the other part of that is that humans are the primary and in some cases exclusive driver of climate change, which I think a lot of people would agree there's still some debate about what role people are playing. But the New York Times does not like that. The New York Times is defending the consensus. But when you hear the consensus on climate change, to me, it sounds a lot like the trust the experts messaging on COVID. Again, we were told 6 feet will slow the spread. Found out years later that was totally made up. On climate change, we've had a number of other similar revelations of things that have been treated as part of the consensus that we later found out were largely politicized research. For example, we've talked about climate attribution. There is an organization called World Weather Attribution that's quoted in every media article about the role climate change is playing in any kind of storm or natural disaster. But research has shown World Weather Attribution has cut corners in their research, and most of what they're putting out isn't even peer-reviewed because their goal, as they have said publicly to media, is to be fast enough to get included in those stories, whether or not the science and the research and evidence adds up or not. So again, as you hear, New York Times pushing back on these incredibly renowned energy experts being unqualified for the Department of Energy because they don't agree with what largely left-wing outside groups have decided is the consensus on climate change, you have to remember the political organizations behind this are hyper-focused on forcing the changing of behaviors away from appliances you like, cars you like, gas, energy, and into their preferred progressive lifestyle choices. So kudos to these energy experts who are going to work with President Trump to make energy more abundant and more affordable for all.